In the shadowed lands of eastern Middle-earth, upon horses, wains and chariots, armed with bows, bound by blood and fire, the Easterlings swept across the plains like a storm unleashed, their arrows darkening the skies. Chariots thundered with the fury of ancient Scythian hordes, while their relentless raids mirrored the wrath of the Huns. Like the Mongols who struck fear into the heart of medieval Europe, the Easterlings' raids were an unyielding tide of terror that left the West shattered in their wake. Welcome to our latest video on the Armies of Middle-earth, in which we will explore the history, society and military tactics of the Men of the East. In FA 463, the swarthy men, also known as the Easterlings, migrated into Beleriand, seeking new land and riches. This race of humans was short, broad, long and strong in the arm, and had much hair on their faces and chests. Their hair and eyes were dark, their skin was sallow or swart, and their women were proud and barbaric. They were not fond of elves, favoured dwarves, and were of many houses, not all friendly to each other nor to outsiders. They were led by two chieftains, Ulfang and Bor. Those of Ulfang ended up fighting on the side of Morgoth, while those of Bor stayed true to the Union of Maedhros. After the War of Wrath, the few surviving Easterlings fled east, where they became kings and chieftains over primitive men. In SA 500, Sauron, believing he had escaped the Valar's judgment, travelled east and south to dominate the primitive men already corrupted by Melkor. As a Dark Lord, he taught these early humans how to construct towns and walls of stone, and armed them with iron. Around SA 1600, the Valar dispatched two blue wizards to Middle-earth, Morinitar and Rumistamo. Their mission was to circumvent Sauron by stirring up rebellion amongst the eastern tribes and search out his hiding place. Ultimately, the two blue wizards failed to find Sauron's hiding place in the east, and their ultimate fate is unknown. What is known is that their work to cause rebellion against Sauron ensured the east never outnumbered the west, ultimately securing victory against Sauron. During the Dark Years, Sauron enticed the Easterlings with promises of loot to join his orcs in assailing the Westlands. After seizing the Rings of Power, Sauron distributed 3 rings to Black Númenóreans, 1 to an Easterling king, Camul, and 5 to other men. Camul became a mighty lord and sorcerer, gaining much power and prestige amongst his people, until SA 2251 when he turned into a Nazgul. Afterwards, Camul became a lieutenant under Sauron, second to the Witch King of Angmar, and was placed in charge of Dol Guldur. In SA 3429, Sauron assembled a great host of orcs, Easterlings, Haradrim, Black Númenóreans, all manner of evil creatures, and even some dwarves, to preemptively attack Gondor. However, the last alliance ultimately prevailed over Sauron in SA 3441. The Easterlings became free from his tyranny, but fell into chaos, driven by tribal rivalries fueled by the Blue Wizards. In SA 490, the Easterlings invaded Gondor between the Sea of Rhûn and the Ash Mountains. Taristar led the Gondorians to victory, driving away the Easterlings by TA 500. By TA 541, the Easterlings invaded northern Ithilien, and Romendasil I was slain in battle. His son Tarambar destroyed the Easterling horde, and by TA 550 launched an offensive, conquering new territory in western Rhûn for Gondor. Easterling attacks against Gondor ceased for centuries, but by TA 1000, the Easterlings intermittently harassed the Northmen, while a shadow befell Greenwood. During the reign of Narmestil I, the Easterlings resumed their attacks upon Gondor, assisted by some Northmen. In TA 1248, Minilcar and Prince Vidugavia defeated a large Easterling army between Ravanion and the Sea of Rhûn, destroying their encampments east of the inland sea. From the First Age until the early Third Age, the Easterlings were racially diverse, divided, and a primitive people. They were first armed by and dependent upon the sons of Fëanor and later Sauron, who also taught them masonry. They most likely adopted crude weaponry, tactics, and formations. Given their descendants, the early Easterlings were most likely nomadic horsemen, representative of ancient Scythians. They would have been lightly armoured and armed with spears, axes, crude swords, and strongly relied on horseback archery. The divided tribes of the Easterlings gradually formed a confederacy known as the Wain Riders, who travelled in great titular wains, consisting of large contingents of cavalry led by chariot-riding chieftains. These wains carried supplies and people, and acted as fortified camps, defended by their women, children and old men. In TA 1851, Sauron stirred the Wain Riders to attack Gondor and her allies. Consequently, the Wain Riders overran and scattered the Northmen residing between Mirkwood and the River Running, In TA 1856, Namasil and Mahari both fell during the Battle of the Plains. The Wain Riders reduced much of the Northmen into slavery and occupied their lands. Then, in TA 1899, Mawini fostered an uprising amongst the Northman slaves, who attacked and burned the Wain Riders' encampment, although many of the rebels were slain by the Wain Riders' women, children and elderly. Kalimetar and Wawini exploited the situation and managed to defeat the main host of the Wain Riders upon the plain of Dagoled. The Wain Riders had also been spreading south beyond Mordor at this time, coming into conflict with the Variags of Khand and Haradrim of Near Harad. Eventually, Sauron brokered a peace between them all and convinced them to attack Gondor together. In TA 1944, the Wain Riders and Variags assembled a great host upon the southern shores of the Sea of Rhûn to assail Gondor on the northern side of Eresh Lithwi, while the Haradrim crossed the river Poros to attack South Ithilien. The northern assault was met by Gondorian forces, led by Ondahir and his two sons, Artamir and Faramir. The Easterlings routed the northern Gondorian army and slew the king and his heirs. As the northern Gondorian army fled, the Wain Riders paused in northern Ithilien to celebrate their victory. However, to their south, the Haradrim were defeated by the southern Gondorian army, led by Eonil. After his great victory, Eonil turned north, taking the Easterlings by surprise at their encampment, burning their wains, and driving many of them into the dead marshes. Many have argued Tolkien took inspiration for the Wain Riders from the Huns, who were also nomadic, known to use fortified wagons, and waged war primarily as horseback archers. Attila the Hun famously fled his war wagon encampment at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, a near-identical scene to the Battle of the Camp of TA 1944. Similar to the Wain Rider invasion, the Huns invaded the steppes north of the Black Sea, defeating and enslaving the Goths residing there, before going on to ally themselves with the Gepidae and Ostrogoths. Tolkien's early name for Mirkwood, Mirkwidu, came from Mirkvida, the dark forest boundary dividing the land of the Goths and Huns. Another ancient people who travelled in war wagons and chariots were the Scythians. As instruments of war, perhaps the Wain Riders used chariots similarly to the scythed chariots of ancient Persia. After the Wain Rider Confederacy dissolved in TA 2063, Sauron gave up his guise as the necromancer of Dol Guldur and raced far east to establish a new confederacy amongst the Easterling tribes. A fierce faction amongst the Easterlings formed into a new tribe, called the Balchoth, who migrated east of the Sea of Rhûn to Rhovanion. Although related to the Wain Riders, the Balchoth were more crudely armed, with fewer horses for riding, the majority of their beasts of burden being used to draw their large wagons. They slaughtered the remaining Northmen still east of Mirkwood, and began raiding Mirkwood. By TA 2509, the Balchoth had mustered a great host along the southern edge of Mirkwood, prompting Cirion to send riders to the Eothiad to ask for aid against the new invaders. Regardless, the army of Gondor prepared to meet the Balchoth on the field of Celebrant, even without any true hope of victory. This battle took place in Calenardon, as Cirion, knowing the defences of the area, knew that he had to fight or allow the Balchoth to put the population of the region to the sword. 6 riders had been sent to Yol. 5 of them were killed on the way north, with the 6th, Borendir, arriving just in time. Eol, realizing that if Gondor fell, his people could soon return to the pitiful existence they were forced to endure under the Wain Riders, marched his 7,000 horsemen and hundreds of mounted archers along the almost 500-mile road that led to Calenardon. Unfortunately for Cirion, his hopes that the River Anduin would slow down the enemy didn't come true. Before he could arrive, the Balchoth built hundreds of boats and started crossing the river. The defenders of the fortifications guarding the western bank did their best to slow down the foe, but were killed and the fortifications were taken. The steward attempted to relieve the battered defenders, but his forces were easily repelled. Cirion started retreating north, but here he was assaulted by a group of orcs and his forces were pushed towards the Anduin. The situation looked extremely bleak as the Balchoth and orcs descended upon the now hopeless Gondorians. A defense was mounted, but they were continuously pushed closer to the river. It was at this point that Eol's host entered the fray. His army crossed the Undeeps, and he led a massed cavalry charge right into the rear of the enemy force. The prospect of victory urged the Gondorians on, who, with renewed vigour, provided the anvil upon which the Eothiad could destroy the enemy host. Those who fled from the field were pursued by the Eothiad, who slaughtered as many as they could, forever ending the threat posed by the Balchoth. The Balchoth were a similar but lesser force compared to that of the Wain Riders. They were less technologically advanced, more chaotic and tribal, and armed with crude weaponry. Moreover, they fought primarily on foot, utilizing horses only to transport wagons rather than for war. However, they were more numerous than their forebears. The wain had been the symbol of the Wain Riders' power, while for the Balchoth, wagons were just a means to nomadic life. It could be argued that the Wain Riders represented the zenith of Easterling military prowess, while the Balchoth were chaotic successors in a waning age. It seems the use of wagons, chariots, and proficient cavalry died with the Balchoth. The first true battle of the War of the Ring began with a massive army of orcs, Easterlings, and Haradrim, led by the Witch King of Angmar himself, assaulting the eastern bank. The sons of the Steward and captains of Gondor, Boromir and Faramir, were entirely blindsided by this assault, but they managed to hastily mount a defense, showing skill and valor. Soon, the untold numbers began to weigh upon the disciplined professional soldiers of Gondor, who were supported by the Rangers of Ithilien. Unable to hold ground in fear of the Witch King, the Gondorians were pushed back to the riverbank by the former King of Angmar's forces. Seeing no other alternative, Faramir and Boromir gave the order for the last bridge over the Anduin to be destroyed, while they led a desperate rearguard action, hoping to buy enough time for the bridge to be brought down. The fighting was fierce as the stalwart Gondorians refused to give an inch, willing to fight to the last man, as each and every one of them were aware of what the consequences of their failure might be. Fortunately, it was just enough to save the western portion of the city, and seeing that the bridge had been destroyed, the two brothers, alongside the surviving 2 soldiers of their company, launched themselves into the powerful flow of the Anduin and just about managed to swim to the other bank. The eastern portion of the city was now fully under Sauron's control, opening up the possibility of the entire city falling. Sauron also dispatched a great host of Easterlings against Dale and Erebor, who slew the kings Brand and Dane Ironfoot, nearly conquering their realms. Tolkien briefly mentioned 2 other groups from the east during the Battle of Pelennor Fields. These were the Variags of Khand, who were neither Easterlings nor Southrons, whose land was southeast of Mordor, and during the Third Age were in conflict with the Wain Riders. We know almost nothing about the Variags, who very well may not have been indigenous to Khand. The Variags joined the Wain Riders against Gondor, and during the War of the Ring were held in reserve at Osgiliath during the Battle of Pelennor Fields. It seems certain that the Variags were inspired by the Varangians, an eastern branch of the Scandinavian Vikings, who overran parts of Russia and spread as far as Constantinople during the 9th and 10th centuries. A group of them formed the Varangian Guard for the Byzantine Emperor. They were Viking warriors who fought by land and river, and often acted as mercenaries. Given this, one could deduce that the Variags were mercenaries who fought primarily with axes. Another elusive group, also found in reserve at Osgiliath during the Battle of Pelennor Fields, was the bearded Easterlings with large axes. They were described to us by Ingold as men of a new sort that we have not met before, not tall but broad and grim, bearded like dwarfs, wielding great axes. Out of some savage land in the wide east they come, we deem. Alongside the Variags, the so-called bearded Easterlings were unleashed by Gothmog after the Witch King of Angmar had died. Some theorize them to be half-dwarfs, given the Easterlings' liking for dwarfs, but Tolkien did not specifically describe them so. The Easterlings were not a unified people. They existed among numerous tribes, often at war with one another. The Blue Wizards further exploited their rivalries to keep them in constant conflict, so as to limit their numbers against the West. However, the Easterlings did have lords, kings, and chieftains. Sauron and perhaps Camul were able to lead and form confederations amongst the Easterlings and form alliances between them, such as the Khand and the Haradrim. Given their Scythian and Hunnic inspirations, the Easterling military structure could be overseen by a great Khan-like figure, typically Sauron, and perhaps Camul before he became a Nazgul. Subordinate to this figure were a council of chieftains, each responsible for their tribe. Below this, as with any general military, were ranks such as captains, sergeants, and other rank-file warriors. It seems that the Easterlings may also have hired mercenaries, such as the Variags of Khand, to supplement their forces in war. The Easterlings were a very diverse people, with a diverse proclivity for armor and arms. Amongst them were swordsmen, spearmen, horsemen, horseback archers, wains, and chariots. We are not given any description of their weapons nor armour, aside from the bearded Easterlings wielding great axes. However, given that the orcs and Haradrim both favoured curved scimitar-like swords, it's reasonable the Easterlings did also. The Haradrim wore corselets of brazen scales and carried spiked shields, so perhaps the Easterlings had similar arms. One could imagine their weapons and armour mirrored something similar to the Scythians or Huns, though Peter Jackson's trilogy portrayed the Easterlings' attire as a blend of Ottoman Turks, Sassanid Persians, and Mongol horsemen. For the wain riders, whose lifestyle revolved around horse riding, wains, and chariots, their primary weapons were most likely bows, spears, and perhaps javelins. From atop their wains, Easterling archers would have fired arrows through firing slits, with spearmen defending them. Being a very divided people, the Easterlings would have adopted very loose formations and simplistic tactics. Just like the early Scythians, the earlier Easterling groups would have acted as horseback archers, performing hit-and-run tactics. They would have been highly mobile given their nomadic nature, covering vast distances to surprise attack their enemies, perhaps performing feigned retreats such as the Mongols did. They would not have adopted phalanx formations like their Western counterparts, nor line-based infantry formations, instead opting for dispersed and loose formations. Much like the Huns, the wain riders would have perfected horseback archery, and were likely capable of performing great feats, like the feigned retreat or Parthian shot. They also may have adopted some heavy cavalry to perform shock cavalry charges. Their primary symbol of military power were their wains, from where they derived their name. During the Middle Ages, war wagons were primarily used for defensive purposes, battlefield control, and as mobile fortresses. They carried supplies and troops to the battlefields, and offered additional layers of protection for war camps. The Huns and Scythians both used war wagons for transportation, mainly to carry their women, children, elderly, tents, loot, and as mobile encampments and logistical bases. The Huns were known to position their war wagons in circles alongside portable fencing for their camps. During battle, archers would fire from firing slits, while spearmen or polearms kept melee adversaries at bay. The wain rider chieftains most likely used war chariots with scythe blades on the sides like those of ancient Persia. These would have been pulled by a team of 4 horses, with a 3-man crew consisting of 1 driver and 2 warriors. They were used to counter tight phalanx formations, such as those of the Greek hoplites or Gondorian soldiers. Overall, the Easterlings were a fascinating and complex people, shaped by diverse culture, alliances, and ambition. Their land of rune, meaning east, inspires images of Asia, and their nomadic lifestyle conjures images of the steppe. The Easterlings hold a fascinating and mysterious history, adding depth to the complex tapestry of Tolkien's world, showcasing the diverse cultures that play crucial roles in the epic struggle between good and evil. Ultimately, the Easterlings were a wild and divided people who would be subdued by the might of the West during the Fourth Age. More videos on the military cultures of Middle-earth are on the way. In the meantime, we're planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi, and space opera universes, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we will catch you on the next one.